Good morning, good afternoon, and evening, wherever you are. And welcome to this second event in this year's series on management and social justice. And the topic is transdisciplinary and technology-based approaches for building a just and fair world. And this event is even more special because this is the first one we are co-hosting with another academic institution from elsewhere in the world. Because as we have mentioned before, that we're trying to create a community of scholars and practitioners who are interested in building this dialogue and changing the world, and look at things with the honest and authentic engagement. And so we wanted to then open this up, the hosting, also to other institutions who are interested in being part of the conversation. So we're building more of a network around this. And so I'm so pleased to announce that University of Bristol, the School of Management at Bristol University, is co-hosting this event. And this is the starting of probably what is to be a longer term engagement with student and faculty collaborations and potential academic collaborations around programs in the future. And I'm so pleased to invite Professor Bailey Smart, who is the head of the School of Management at Bristol Universities, to say a few words before we start the panel. And Bailey is not just an academic leader in terms of holding a position of the head, but she's also a very strong researcher and a thought leader. She works in the area of operations and innovation management, and she works with especially industrial sustainability. And she works in collaboration with several global agencies, and especially based on the US and also elsewhere, and consulting, big consulting organizations. And she is a very highly renowned and well-published scholar in this field. And she's appointed member of the UK government's Innovation Caucus to provide thought leadership in this space. And so welcome, Bailey, over to you. Please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Latha. Thank you very much for offering me the opportunity just to say a few words. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today with three fantastic colleagues from the School of Management at the University of Bristol, and meeting, of course, the fantastic team that you have at the new school. So I'm particularly happy because Agnes and I, 2 years ago, came to visit the new school, and very soon after, I think we had the COVID pandemic, and lots of things came to a standstill, including our plans to build a relationship between the new school and the Milano New School and the School of Management at Bristol. And I think what was striking about our initial meeting, I won't repeat some of the words you said, Latha, because they did, we did have a bit of a giggle about how we saw management and the role of academics in academia and making change happen. But was your passion really, and the new school's passion, and our growing passion for transformational leadership, for social change, and not being like every other business and management school out there. And that, I think, really united us. So that sort of common ambition was something that certainly Agnes and I went away feeling and thinking, well, this is a school that we really must build an international link with. We both recognized the importance of addressing global and societal challenges with the management research that we're doing. And I think we're both, schools that are very much doing that, and recognize that if we're going to do that well, we need the union of business, society and government to come together. And your conversation series in social change very much emphasizes the need for different kinds of stakeholders to be engaged in that very, very important conversation. So I think, we are in the business of creating the next generation of future leaders and global citizens, which is, I think, the same business that you're in. So I think there was huge alignment there. And now that the pandemic is not quite over, but we are starting to find some place to breathe and do new things. I think sharing and co-hosting this is a huge honor for us. And I'm really looking forward to some new things that we could be doing. Wonderful to make this maybe an annual event, a biannual event, and continue engaging our different communities to do more research and thought leadership together. So I just want to say a huge thank you really to the ladies, the all-female team that we have here in front of us for making this happen. So absolutely delighted to be here, and thank you. Over to you, I think.
Yes, thank you, Peli, and I'm also excited to welcome our panel moderator, Dean Erin Cho. Erin is the Dean of the School of Undergraduate Studies within the school's public engagement. And under her leadership, we launched brand new management, leadership, and entrepreneurship program at the undergraduate level for the first time at the Schools of Public Engagement. And we had actually built the curriculum around sustainable development goals, because one of the questions we have constantly asked in this series and in management at the new school is like, management for what? Right? Because management has to have a purpose that is beyond just like saving some money. And so we wanted to kind of take a very ambitious and a bold and audacious kind of a what that we wanted to address. So we picked the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a kind of a pedagogical framework to weave through the entire undergraduate program in terms of managing for the leadership and management and entrepreneurship is to solve global challenges, big problems that we come together to solve and make the world better. And and over to you, Erin. Thank you.
Thank you, Latha. By the way, I have to bring my face very close to the screen. Otherwise, you will not be able to hear me. So very sorry for your having to see my face so big, but just, pardon. Again, thank you, Latha, very much for your thorough and very kind introduction. I like to say a few words about how, I, get to be the sort of a moderator of this session by giving you some high level, introduction on my research, what I study. I have a very long academic career, so I built a teaching and research portfolio with a range of topics in the space of innovation, design strategies, branding, and entrepreneurship. And in tackling these issues, I frame my research questions based on 3 pillars of discipline. One is the liberal arts and social science, particularly in the space of psychology and sociology. And the second space is design and how design interacts with people. And the third space is technology, focusing on online engagement. And I say that the transdisciplinarity has been well grounded and guiding my work throughout. So for example, one of the key research area that I examine is human-computer interactions. In particular, I investigate people's perceptual, cognitive, and decision-making processes interacting with interface design and how it affects user behavior of the technology and service innovation. I also interrogate how this technology-enabled human experiences are shaped and manifest in society, and how they can be designed in such a way to build better relationships with key stakeholders in our living and social environment, including organizations, communities, and governments. So I can say that the thematic focus of today's webinar exactly aligns with my current research focus and the trajectory. So for that, I'm very grateful for Latha to invite me as a moderator for this session. And with that, I'd like to switch gears to introduce today's panelists. As indicated, we have 3 panelists from Bristol and 2 from our new school. And in the interest of time and also to ensure the smooth transition between speakers, I will invite them with their names, and each speaker will introduce herself and proceed to present their research highlights related to the today's theme. And each panelist will have 10 minutes altogether, and I will give you 2-minute notice like this before the time is up. So for the audience, please feel free to submit questions while panelists are speaking. And if you can, it will be appreciated if you could indicate who you like to address the question to. So with that, I'd like to turn the table to our first speaker, Agnes.
Thank you very much, Erin. I'll just share my screen. Is that sharing okay? Yes, perfect. Well, my name is Agnes Nairn, and I'm a professor of marketing here at the School of Management at the University of Bristol. And my work looks at the effects of marketing on the most vulnerable in society, particularly children and young people. My focus is always on the public policy implications of what I find. In terms of social justice, I'm particularly interested in finding the balance between the rights that a corporation has to commercial free speech, which is something much stronger in the USA than in the UK, because you have the First Amendment and we don't, and the rights of the citizen to privacy and protection from the ill effects of marketing in general and advertising, I guess, in particular. So the themes I work on are, for example, the effects of marketing of high fat, salt and sugar food and drink on obesity and ill health. So the UK government has recently considered there's sufficient academic research evidence now to warrant the introduction of a sugar tax. So that has meant that corporations have taken sugar out of drinks, and it's kind of changed the way things are marketed. And very recently, the government has decided there's sufficient research evidence to propose a ban on all advertising of high salt, fat and sugar foods after 9 o'clock in the evening on television to stop children seeing these products. I've also done a lot of research on materialism and the impact that advertising has on levels of materialism and thus children's self-esteem, their life satisfaction, their relationships with their parents, and often their body image. Work I did with the Brazilian government and the Economist Intelligence Unit concluded that the cost to Brazilian society and its health service of obesity and mental health issues outweighed any economic benefits through taxes, jobs, etc., from the consumer goods industry. Most recently, I've been working on how advertising for gambling is associated with a range of harms experienced by young people and children. And there's been a lot of change already as a result of research evidence, such as a ban on using credit cards for gambling, limiting the amount you can spend, and the Gambling Act review, which is our big piece of gambling legislation, is currently under complete overhaul, and our research evidence has been put forward to that, and we're waiting for the results. So how does transdisciplinarity intersect with the kind of research that I do? Well, high salt, sugar and fat food research has to be nutritionists. I mean, you have to have an agreed nutrient profiling system if you're going to decide how to measure and display levels of high salt, sugar and fat. We need to work with medics to understand the on ill health. And humanities and us from the scientists, we need to understand culture and lifestyle, interact with genetic and other dispositions. And then, of course, we need economists to calculate it. If we look at the gambling research at the University of Bristol, all faculties, that means life science, social science and law, engineering and arts, all working on, so from the history of sport and how that intersects with gambling, mathematical modeling of online gambling behaviors, to how shame in some cultures prevents the seeking of gambling harm. So it's how we eat and drink and spend our money and our leisure, how the marketing industry influences that, is bound up in a very complex web of biological, psychological, social culture factors that really demand interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity. So what about technology? How does that fit in what I do? Well, as marketing and advertising moves online, the new industries of and MarTech, or advertising and marketing technology, are coming to dominate communications. Sorry, Erin, did you want to say something? No? Okay, so your hand went up. But technology has also become a part of the problem that my research is trying to address, and therefore it has to become part of a solution. And a big part of this is policy and regulation. So if I take my most recent work, this is about how esports gambling advertising is related to harms experienced by young people. Now, I don't know if you're esports fans, but if not, here's some examples of current esports: League of Legends, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, FIFA. These are organized, competitive, professional sports that happen not on a football field or a race course or in a boxing ring, but online in a completely virtual world. Now, importantly for our research, the average age of a player, professional player of these sports, is just under 25, and the average age of a spectator is about 26, which is very different to the average spectator of football or racing, which is over 50. And we discovered that regulators do not understand esports and they do not understand this ecosystem. And in some recent regulatory reviews, esports are hardly mentioned, which is pretty shocking when the gambling part of esports alone is worth $10 billion. The second technology-related point is the fact that advertising is moving into social media space. And advertising in social media space has two consequences. The first is that paid for adverts in social media are, of course, organized by an ad tech ecosystem and the algorithms behind it. This is a pretty complicated ecosystem. Don't even need to read the names to see that it's quite complex. And I was a special advisor to the House of Lords inquiry into UK advertising in a digital age recently, and we kept coming back to a statement that was made by the Chief Brand Officer of Procter & Gamble, who was worried about this ecosystem. And what he said was this: he said, "We serve ads to consumers through a non-transparent, compliance to common standards, unreliable measurement, hidden rebates, and new invention like methbot fraud." There are actually very few people that understand this ecosystem, and they're not in business schools and they're not in government. They are inside these little companies which are spread all over the world. If the government doesn't really understand this ecosystem, then it's very difficult for them to regulate it. And this is the chief executive of the Advertising Standards Authority who was giving evidence to a House of Lords inquiry. And the Lord Bishop of St. Albans said to him, "So you've really very little idea of how many adverts kids are actually seeing online." And he said, "The evidence is really hard to get. And the challenge here is there's no agreed metrics to calculate exposure to advertising for children online. And we know about it." So when they're worrying about it, it's pretty worrying for us too. The second technology-related problem is what consumers do with social media advertising. Unlike TV advertising, which we don't show our friends, we don't phone up a friend and say, "You must watch this advert." We do share social media advertising by liking it and sharing it. And GIFs and memes are a massive part of this. So this was, interestingly, the most popular gambling tweet with children and young people in our research, which is strange until you realize it's all about getting ready to watch a match. So some issues from technology in the kind of research that I do, but how can transdisciplinarity and technology be part of the solution? Well, first of all, regulators and policymakers need to get mathematicians, computer scientists, and tech geeks into their inquiries. They're not there enough. Secondly, the technology companies need to use technology to solve some of the problems. If you create an algorithm, include people to see, you can also create an algorithm from what you're seeing. And thirdly, as social scientists, and I'm sure my colleagues are going to talk as marketing academics with computer scientists and with mathematicians. So to finish, I'll say what I mentioned before, how the market is all bound up in the complex web of biological, ecological, social, and cultural that demand transdisciplinarity, and they also demand a deep understanding of technology.
Thank you so much, Agnes. I think there's some technical issues. Part of the presentation was very choppy. If one of your, if one of the panelists experience such a thing, I advise that you turn off the video while speaking. So thank you so much. I don't see a question submitted on chat. So I will move on to our next speaker, Stephanie Decker.
Right, thank you, Erin. Let me quickly share the screen. Okay, welcome everyone. Hope you can see and hear me well. My name is Stephanie Decker. I'm Professor of History and Strategy at the University of Bristol. My background is actually in history. I was trained in a history department, and my original interest in business actually comes from the historical relationship of multinationals and their local communities, particularly in African countries, around institutional change. And moving into the business school has been really fascinating because to some extent, it's enabled me to continue this very transdisciplinary research, to continue looking into some of these issues around these relationships as they were evolving into the present day. So the current piece is a collaborative piece of work with George Obeng Dankwa, focusing in particular on Ghana. And many of the processes that we've been researching for this paper were actually processes that I experienced as a researcher going to Ghana in the mid-noughties, and I always found very intriguing watching how things were changing on the streets, how technology, but also advertising, all of these things were bringing change about in ways that then in later years, George and I had the opportunity to research in depth. So my paper today is about co-opting the base of the pyramid. Essentially, we're looking at micro-entrepreneurs in Ghana, but these are sort of representative of the kind of business initiatives you see all across the continent. The picture there is actually from Rwanda. So the kind of small-scale trading across different sectors is really what we're interested in. And in this time period, what we saw was really multinationals moving into this space as part of also discourse around the base of the pyramid. And for this talk, we'll also look a little bit at the role of technology in this context and in how far this mattered or not. So when we talk about local micro-businesses, we're really talking about three distinct sectors that are very present in most African countries. You'll see a lot of this going on. The large picture is really markets for consumer goods. So fast-moving consumer goods are often sold in informal markets, things on display, and there have been a lot of interesting trends in that area. Top right-hand corner, this is somebody who's commercially known as a street hawker. There's a lot of traffic jams, so people will come up to a car, sell you minutes. It's another well-established business model. Bottom right-hand corner is a form of traditional finance, a credit circle known locally as Susu. And these are really the three main industries we were interested in to see what change was happening, what was the role of technology, and ultimately what really made a difference to how this change was affecting local communities. And for this talk, I wanted to briefly kind of reflect on the question of whether technology matters in marginalized communities, because a lot of technology obviously is developed in more developed countries and then tends to sort of trickle down into less developed countries. And this is really a trend that we've only recently seen change. Now, there's been interesting research, including from the World Bank, that access to mobile phones has enhanced GDP growth in lots of these communities and has the potential to address information asymmetry. So that sounds like an extremely positive story. Payment systems as well, essentially also sometimes mobile phone minutes is a form of alternative payment systems, have helped communities with little access to banking services. But importantly here is the fact that the poor are not just consumers of services. And I think that that's a key issue where technology can be more thorny. A lot of these communities are perhaps presented as underserved in the traditional sense, not having access to the goods and services that perhaps more affluent members of the community do. But I think our work highlighted that this also has opened up gaps for entrepreneurial activities within poor communities. So entrepreneurial activity that leads to livelihoods for people who themselves are poor or maybe just above the poverty threshold. So exploiting these loopholes with, or these gaps with business models are also very generative for these communities. So interestingly enough, what we found is that technology sometimes can close these gaps that have provided income opportunities to entrepreneurs in these spaces, but not always. So our paper tries to sort of unpack what is this differentiated impact of technology. And maybe very briefly, for those of you who may not be familiar with the base of the pyramid literature, though you may be, in which case, I'm just going through very briefly. It's a concept that the world's poor are really a huge untapped consumer market that corporations should be exploring. This has been put forward by Prahlad and co-authors. The suggestion is the multinationals should develop business models to target them that will make money for multinationals, but also reduce poverty and so bring benefit, classical win-win situation. The reality is multinationals have struggled to access these communities. They lack the kind of social capital. There's a trust deficit in engaging with communities that they previously ignored. So it doesn't tend to be that straightforward in practice. And very importantly, there was very influential criticism of the model by Anil Karnani at the very beginning when this was proposed, that considering the poor just as consumers is problematic. We also need to see them as potential producers because that allows them to generate the income to actually be able to spend and thus create a virtuous circle. But obviously all of these models very much are based on an economic definition of poverty, very much in contrast to the work of, say, Amartya Sen, who focused on the idea that poverty should really be seen as an absence of capability, of opportunity, of knowledge. So there's been a renewed interest in questions around in how far can we recast poverty as an issue that is an absence of capability, and exiting from poverty has also got to do with how people build capabilities. So Ansari and co-authors have highlighted that maybe we should be evaluating base of pyramid and also microfinance approaches really in terms of do they enhance a community's social capital rather than the economic capital. And this is really the approach and to some extent the question we take in this research. So we look at what is the informal sector in Ghana, just to briefly give you an idea, traditionally dominated by these micro businesses, often something where informally sachets are being filled from a large box being bought. That happens very commonly and has been the case for a very long time. Mobile phones and previously landlines were offered as a service instead of ownership model known as space to space. I remember when I first went to Ghana, I went into space to space booths due to place international calls because there were not a lot of landlines available. Mobile phones were too expensive. And finally, the Susu collectors are really very much part of the traditional credit arrangements for the unbanked people who weren't welcome in bank branches. And essentially they collect small daily savings, often market traders. They're not welcome in banks. They also tend to work very long hours and really cannot access banks during working hours. In return, you might get a batch of savings back, or you might be eligible for lending from the Susu collector. So it effectively fills a gap where the formal financial sector has left communities completely underserved. And within the community, these are solutions that have emerged by a group of people over time. Now, multinationals have piggybacked on these business models in a range of different ways. And you see these little sachets here. That's basically the replacement of the self-made sachets. It's sometimes been labeled as a single-serve revolution. But essentially, it has meant that micro businesses who used to do this themselves previously are now a distribution network, and the ability to kind of make a margin on these has been much reduced, while the actual price to the consumer has gone up. So essentially, this has been very profitable for companies. In the mobile phone sector, really what you see is that mobile phones have become more common. So we've sort of shifted back from service towards ownership. And what individuals now sell, very often no longer in a store, but essentially hawking on street sides, are SIM cards and very small value charge cards. I mean, the value of a charge card, the minimum value went down in the space of maybe 2 years from the equivalent of $5 to under $1. Also, this has facilitated transfer and purchases, as we already mentioned. In finance, it's been more interesting because really what we see is a switch. Susu collectors have seen more support from the finance sector that previously didn't want to deal with them. Bank accounts are now offered to collectors, and through Susu collectors, credit from the formal financial system is being made accessible to informal borrowers who don't have any collateral. So it's become a new form of microfinance. When we talk to people, perceptions of these new business models were overwhelmingly negative, particularly for fast-moving consumer goods and telecoms. Most people said there were no benefits, largely focused around the issue of a reduced income, so a reduction in their livelihoods. In finance, the picture was slightly different, so it was more cautiously positive, and I just wanted to briefly take you through why we think that is. And for this, really what we're trying to see is, or try to argue, is this difference between technology and social capital, and they affect each other in very different ways. So for fast-moving consumer goods, we see a low impact of technology, whereas for telecoms, we see a high impact. Yet both have been relatively negative in their assessment how this has affected them. In finance, we really see a medium impact that's really focused around the initial business model of being quite small, personalized, without any collateral as a point for savings and loans. And it's really interesting that technology here hasn't had a very consistent impact. So multinational business models for FMCG has really replaced the old model. For telecoms, it has shifted the model from services back to ownership. Both of these have been evaluated negatively. What we've seen for SUSU is really that there's been more services created around the central business model with relatively few changes to the initial way in which, or the original way in which SUSU collectors operate. Now, the reasons that our interviewees gave us for these evaluations was really that they felt their status was reduced, particularly in FMCG and telecoms. They really saw a reduction in their social capital because their income, their livelihoods were affected. They could no longer offer, say, some loans or some support to people. They were no longer seen as people who were doing well. They could send their kids to school. So this close link between the economic income and the social capital that matters to them. SUSU collectors, we got something very different because their social capital was maintained. They found in many ways that while perhaps their profitability was reduced, they now had a big financial institution. If debtors didn't want to pay up, they could get outsiders in. Now that was perceived as quite threatening in communities, led to debtors much more likely to be paying up. So to a much more regularized behavior in terms of savings and loans, and they found they were much better recouping their losses, had fewer bad debts. So overall, they found that their social status wasn't affected and they had some real benefits, even if economic benefits may have been reduced. So to conclude, the story that we feel is really emerging around this issue of technology in poorer communities is that when we see multinationals come into these communities, they often bring technologies with them that may be in some ways really helpful to certain communities, but can also be quite negative, particularly when we focus on informal micro-entrepreneurs in African countries. This technology creates new winners and losers. That's really the key story we're trying to tell, and we're trying to understand why that is the case. We generally find that Ansari et al.'s focus on social capital really helps explain what is going on here. Where technology reduces social capital, we see more damage, whereas where it enhances social capital, we see a more cautious acceptance of these collaborations and the technology that comes with them. Generally speaking, technological innovations that get exported tend to reduce friction negotiation between people, but that's really the meat of what generates social capital in these communities. And that leads to mutuality, networks of mutual dependence. It requires and generates social capital in these communities. And this is really important in terms of the livelihood strategies in communities that live on or below the poverty threshold, simply because if these solutions are not generating more income and economically they're not benefiting people, and at the same time undermining the social capital of the entire community and of individuals that allows them to kind of weather difficult periods, the overall impact of some of these technological innovations can be very negative in this case. But we also felt that, particularly what we see for the SUSU collectors, I think we're in situations where technology really works to at least not affect or perhaps possibly enhance social capital. We see these effects are actually far more positive. Okay, I end this here and stop sharing.
Thank you, Stephanie. Our next speaker is Roberta Bernardi.
Thank you, Erin, and thanks for inviting me to this event. My name is Roberta Bernardi. I'm a senior lecturer in management at the School of Management of the University of Bristol. My main research is on digital technology and digital innovation in healthcare. I'm particularly interested in how healthcare organizations and healthcare professionals can adopt innovations, can adopt technologies, information technologies to innovate the health service. And more recently, I've focused on digital technologies for health self-management. So that links to the topic that I'm going to introduce today, which is about the new rise of Patient 2.0, his digital health, a new revolution for social justice in healthcare. So my talk will also draw on some interviews that I have conducted as part of my study on online health communities for people with diabetes. And I'm going to present you with two arguments. So a first argument in favor of digital health and a second argument in favor against digital health, particularly when it comes to social justice, and then conclude the talk with some reflections about this. So just to give you a bit of a background, so why do people have such an interest in digital health, particularly when it comes to health self-management? That's because it's become very difficult for the health services to actually address the needs of people who have chronic conditions and comorbidities. These are some statistics from a report from the King's Fund in the UK. So in 2012, we had like more than 15 million people with one or more long-term conditions. And this accounts for like 70% of primary and acute care budget. And as you can imagine, sometimes these conditions, particularly obesity or mental health conditions, are linked, they are health issues, but also they are linked to underlying social issues, socioeconomic issues that people that affects these people. So these are some so digital health fundamentally has actually changed the way we consume healthcare. So we can actually consume healthcare without going through healthcare professionals. This is the example of people now looking for more information, health information online. So for example, according to the Office of National Statistics in 2019, 56% of adults in the UK looked for health information online. There are also some statistics in the UK about the amount of adults, for example, 27% of adults who own and use a wearable device, and 1 in 8 in the UK also used mobile health apps regularly to monitor their well-being, according to a survey in 2016. So what is the argument in favor of digital health? So first of all, there is this notion of medical paternalism, and this is actually expressed quite well by this patient with type 2 diabetes. This refers to the health service in the UK. At least this is her perception. So they are very paternalistic in this country. You get patted on the head, there, dear, go away, do what we say. So for people, particularly that want to actually have control of their health, digital health can be of great support. And this is also expressed by this quote from a patient with type 2 diabetes. This patient is actually talking about continuous glucose monitoring, which is a device that allows people with diabetes to actually continuously monitor the level of glucose in the blood. And as we can see, this person felt very empowerment. It said that was the most powerful form of self-management of a condition. He mentioned the ability to manage the condition on his own, and the fact that he doesn't have to rely on doctors to measure the success or failure of those results. So he can see the results instantly. And I'm sure doctors do agree that this is something great for the health service, and also it facilitates their job, because it's not that doctors do not want to look after their patients, but because there are so scarce resources in health service, it's not something they can do continuously. So the fact that actually patients can have these tools and actually use them to monitor their health and get better and gain control of their health is great for doctors too. On the other hand, the argument against that is more critical about these tools is are patients really free? And us as citizens or as individuals, are we really free when we use these tools? Some people think that this is actually an extension. So the use of these tools is an extension of the paternalistic model of care, particularly when these tools use some form of nudging. Just to give you an example, some nudging could be, for example, on your phone, you could have a notification saying, oh, you only walked 8,000 steps today. Why not try and do 10,000 steps tomorrow? And therefore, there is this idea that through this nudging, you can actually instill behavior change and make people more responsible for their own health self-management. One of the criticism about this is that people are reduced to numbers, and that actually these technologies, which Lupton defines as technology of the self, are used to induce self-discipline and control through monitoring and surveillance. So that this defeats the argument that actually as individuals through these technologies, we're actually free. On top of that, one important thing to add is the decontextualization of the self, because these technologies, they're not concerned about the reasons why you couldn't. For example, why can't this person do more than 8,000? What are the social, cultural, or institutional factors that may inhibit that person to achieve that? For example, do they live in their neighborhood? Do they actually have the facilities or the space to actually be active? And this is linked to the biomedicalization. So basically, the blame of ill health is transferred from society to individuals, and that increases, and therefore, whereas there could be some underlying social inequalities that actually are responsible for these lifestyle choices. And people who have to struggle and manage their own health day by day, they actually find it very difficult to live by the perfect number, which may also lead to a sense of failure, as if, it's been actually their fault, like this person, when she says that for her, losing weight is extremely difficult. And obviously, by augmenting the distance between the doctor and the patients, digital health increases the vulnerability of those who are very ill and anxious and unsatisfied, and they may need more reassurance. So digital health then risks widening health inequalities. So to conclude, on the bright side, digital health can actually empower patients by giving them more control. But we have to question, is it helping those that really need help, or are those that actually, the very ill or the more vulnerable, are actually being sort of left out? And therefore, we need to start thinking about whether there are new models, community-based approaches to actually integrate digital health in order to rebalance inequities for greater social justice. Like I said before, it could be that someone cannot really perform as in terms of living by the perfect numbers, because there could be other contextual factors which are more linked to society that may actually prevent this person from actually taking good care of their health. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Roberta, very much. So this wraps up the presentation by the faculty from Bristol. And now I'd like to invite two faculty from the new school. The first speaker is going to be Colleen Macklin.
Hello, everyone. I'm incredibly excited to participate today. Everything that Stephanie, Roberta, and Agnes have described is scratching a particular itch in my interests. I have a background in photography and international affairs, but I'm a game designer. I'm a professor in the program of design and technology, as well as the director of our graduate program there. And my work is primarily in games, although, as you'll see, I'm going to show you some examples. These games are a little bit different from some of the entertainment games you might be used to, at least for the majority of my career. So let's see here. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see a picture of a very strange map of the United States, which is organized proportionally in terms of electoral college votes. This is a project that, let's see, sorry, I'm having some window problems. This is a project that began in 2004. It was really my sort of introduction to the power of games, in particular video games, to explore a wide variety of systemic issues. In this case, I was asked to gather together a group of design students to design a game about the Electoral College. And this is the game we created. It's a fast-paced game where you're playing two candidates against each other and trying to select issues that will win Electoral College votes in different states. For those of you who don't know how the Electoral College works, don't worry. I didn't either at the beginning of this process. And it's still a confounding and frustrating aspect of American electoral politics. However, what I will say is that this game, it was never released. So in some ways, I would consider it a failure. However, the students who made the project, when we ended the project, all said to me that this was one of the best things they've been involved in their time at Parsons, because it was a moment when they actually realized that they understood something about the world and it was fun to figure it out. So what I would say is what we all learned that 16, 17 years ago, is that to start with the system and design from the system out is a way to actually understand how those systems can be gamed. So when you think about the world, we think about how designed systems as well as natural systems interact. And I would say from a transdisciplinary perspective, systems underlie everything that you've heard from our other participants so far. And for me, as a game designer, game designs are the pop cultural form of systems. So they're how we actually begin to learn how they work by playing with them, which is both good and bad. And I'll explain that in a second. After this project, started a research lab at Parsons. I think it was one of the first research labs at Parsons, called Pet Lab, a prototyping education and technology lab. But secretly, we were mostly making games, and we were designing games with different partners. Our first project was called Reactivism. It was a game designed for a festival in New York City called Come Out and Play, where everyone gathers together in the streets and plays games that have been designed specifically for the urban context, for sidewalks. And our game was about the history of activism. So here are a few images from our first iteration of this game. It actually explores the history of activism, such as the Stonewall riots, where the gay rights movement began in the United States, as well as this is Union Square. This is a labor protest that began the 8-hour work week in the United States as well. That by embodying the positions of different protesters and understanding the history of activism, we begin to understand why things are the way they are today. This game's been played in about 6 other cities, including Atlanta, Beijing, Philadelphia by the students at Penn, and a variety of others. So as you'll see, I don't just make video games, I make games that are situated outside in different contexts and use bodies as well as brains. This is a game designed with a think tank in Washington, DC, to raise awareness about the federal deficit and how it works, as well as compare it to personal debt. They're very different things. And it was called Budget Ball on the Mall. It was a game that was played between college students across the United States, culminating in a match on the White House lawn, essentially, or backyard, between congressional budget officers and the winning college teams. It looks kind of like this. In the game, you budget different power-ups, and you also try to deal with deficits by taking sacrifices. And it is a physical, fiscal sport. And then finally, Pet Lab has worked over 10 years with the Red Cross, different organizations as part of the Red Cross series of different groups, including the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Here I am learning a game in Uganda. We've traveled the world learning local games and working with Red Cross volunteers who are also people who live in the places where climate disaster happens more frequently, to modify those games in order to speak to climate preparedness and climate change mitigation. Finally, I do make entertainment games that are a bit nerdy. This is on Apple Arcade. Apple is our publisher for this game. It's part of my company, Local Number 12. It's called Dear Reader. And it's a series of word puzzles that let you work through different books in classic literature. We've tried to really raise underrepresented voices in classic literature books. We're using all public domain literature in order to be able to feature over 100 books in this particular game. Finally, my work right now is fairly experimental. This is a project called Cloud Theory. It is an exploration of artificial intelligence if AI didn't work, but just played. So I'm really focused on how we can use artificial intelligence in ways that help us understand better its possibilities and limitations. In this case, you're laying on the ground, looking at cloud shapes. The AI will see a shape in the cloud and talk about it with you. This was partially funded by Chanel, as well as the New York City Media Lab, and also some funding from the university. It's an early project that is going to be launched, I hope, this year, where you too can talk with an artificial intelligent friend. Finally, I write books about game design and about the power of iteration, which I would say is perhaps the most relevant thing to any transdisciplinary conversation. That is, how do we mitigate failure through the iterative process by prototyping, testing, in game design parlance, that's called playtesting, evaluation, and moving through that cycle. I'm just going to close by describing some new work that I'm doing and writing I'm doing around systems and game design for the end of the world. I'm very interested in game design process, and I'll just say three quick things. First of all, systems. Games are the pop cultural medium of systems. They're how we begin to understand how they work as children and adults. I would say that real world systems and games are comparable to these images here, where you play with a kitten, you learn about the feline species, but you don't necessarily take on the dangers and risks of playing with real world systems. And that's games provide powerful systemic metaphors that transform the way we actually design systems for the world. So Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, focuses on how we use the idea of a zero-sum game to underpin systemic racism in the United States. Game theory is obviously a very powerful set of ideas about rational actors and choice. And finally, meritocracy, which is an idea that actually doesn't really exist in the real world, but somehow in games is pervasive. Worlds and the design of worlds is something that I think we have to focus on and understand better in terms of thinking about this new era that we're in, this new geologic epoch, the Anthropocene. N.K. Jemisin, the sci-fi writer, aptly says that the fiction we absorb has an impact on the reality we tend to perceive. So how do we imagine new worlds? And to close, agencies. Games are the art form of agency, as T. Wen describes them. They are how we actually pass around different forms of agency and learn to act in new ways in the world. That's it. You can find me on Twitter at Colleen Macklin, and I hope that this is, if not answered questions, maybe raise some new ones for the group.
Thank you, Colleen. Just to let you know that gamification is one of the key topics when it comes to online engagement, particularly in terms of how to enhance the stickiness with the system, the software. So with that, I'd like to invite the last panelist, not the least, Latha Poonamallee.
Let me unmute, yes. I'm so used to muting myself through the entire event because I speak in the front, when we open, and then I close with the thank you. So very rarely I'm on the panel, and in this particular panel, I'm really excited to be here. Thank you very much. And one part of, it's like I'm wearing a couple of different hats in my work and professional and entrepreneurial life. And so one of the areas of work that I've been doing for a while is on social entrepreneurship, but social enterprises that actually develop or adopt technology. And not just ICT, which is the information communication technology, but all of STEM in terms of coming up with new, diagnostics and new kind of solutions for environmental issues and things like that. So one of the things that I talked about earlier about, Stephanie talked about the bottom of the pyramid one. And so the social entrepreneurship has been an area that's kind of been interesting to me as a new model, and it seemed to provide something that balances different, conflicting goals. And pretty much all of my academic career has been in paradox, so this was a nice context to explore the paradox of managing conflicting goals. And one of the things that quite a while back, I wrote a paper on, social entrepreneurship being co-opted, because this is kind of like a battle, right? Like social ventures try to co-opt business models to do good, and then you are being the big market, and then they get co-opted back. And for example, like micro-lending companies, many of them I work very closely, know very well with in the Indian context, and they all become co-opted when they reach a particular scale. And then they get private banking license, and then that's the end of their social capital, the social network and the capital, because they kind of start serving other interests because they're funders. And similarly, but I was curious about technology innovation, because technology innovation as literature has evolved separately. But a lot of social and environmental problems today do end up using technology, new technologies to address some of these issues. So last year, I published an edited volume, and I have a group of colleagues, and we kind of created the space called socio-tech innovation, which is that social innovation that explicitly creates new technology or new inventions and discoveries, and or adopt for a particular solution and audience. And so we had this book that came out that covered a lot of cases, because it's such a new space that we thought we would look at. I like inductive work, so we looked at cases to see what's going on. And so there's a lot of, and I do believe that there is obviously not just that we are embedded in technology, so it's not like we can ignore it unless we decide that we want to go off the grid. And then you will still need like, geothermal heating and solar power if you want to go off the grid and have electricity. And heat. So which means like, technology is kind of the ground that we live in today, and it's present. And so how do organizations that want to serve not just the base of the pyramid. I think base of the pyramid looks at it, like you said, about consumers and a particular segment, but also talking about, for instance, like design. Like 80% of the products in the world are designed for 20% of the world, and the rest of the world has to just take it. And so, whereas like many of these social enterprises that develop their own technology, just adopt it to their context, really then it's ground, like as Colleen mentioned, that you go from I think from inward to outward, or things like that. And so we've been kind of studying that. And as I said, the book is it's an interesting one, where we have profiled a number of social ventures in different spaces. And so obviously, like, I think one of the, but I also like to think of myself as a pretty discerning technophile, and I am definitely no doubt about it that I like technology. And but I like to see that it is used with some discernment. And it's definitely you can develop a lot of contextually relevant and industry specific solutions that are mitigating for different kind of challenges. Definitely, it's used in reducing gaps to access to education and health and financing. And one of the things that Roberta talked about with the e-health, digital health and the e-health platform, telehealth platforms, they have truly, I think, reduced the gap in access, especially when you have large population like in India, with really high level of penetration of cell phone technology, and the data plans are like so cheap. And so people can actually use that to get some consultations for healthcare and things like that, which they never could before. And so there are areas that technologies like, really helped in making the gaps smaller. And also when they're developed in a contextually relevant ways, then you honor and meet the needs of the people instead of retrofitting something that was developed for some other country or some other context, like you said, the 10,000 steps or whatever, into a kind of environment that doesn't fit. And but one of the challenges, as in this, I'm wearing the hat of a tech entrepreneur who started with real social goals. And the reason I'm saying started with real social goals is we just signed a a funding term sheet, and so then we have to also serve certain other goals. So my company, it's InMed Prognostics, and we're headquartered in the US, partly because of the funding reasons, but most of our development and validation has happened in India. We are the first company to provide neuroassessment, like state-of-the-art neuroassessment using MRI and CT and all those tools that do not use Caucasian data as the baseline, because every other commercially available product uses Caucasian databases and reference ranges, and which means like it is truly relevant for 80% of the world, because the global majority is not Caucasian. And if all healthcare tools, and this was not like, this used to be like that for women even here, like till 20, 30 years back, I think medical researchers thought that women were smaller men, that we did not have separate endocrinology, we did not have our own, system. We were just smaller men. As long as we can get a dosage fixed appropriately to our body mass, we'll be fine. And so most of the clinical research in those days oversampled men. And today, I think even now, most of the clinical research in terms of biomedical equipment development, solution development, oversamples Caucasian population. And so we're the first people to do that. So the starting point was truly in the context of, in the context of the global majority. And we were looking at, because I've always been interested in healthcare access, and as healthcare is a human right, that everybody should have access to it. And so my partner and I, we've been friends for a very long time. And when we were chatting, and we found that, this is an area that brain health is something nobody really thinks about, and in a proactive way. And so we wanted to kind of explore how to do that in a proactive way. And we also then started learning more about what are the tools available. And so we bring that solution to India. And the challenge is this, right? This is an expensive proposition to develop new technology. So it's an interdisciplinary solution. It has data science, artificial intelligence, clinical application like neurologists, people that actually use it. So you and anatomical, biological expertise like neuroscience, and we need market expertise, like if you have to have adoption, and so there's a lot of interdisciplinary work that goes on in my team, and but the challenge is that that's expensive, and so which means that for the next stage we do need more money, and when we take money from the market, and that is the real challenge with technology for social adoption, and why it is the multinational companies that lead it in some form. Like we were incubated in GE Healthcare's incubation system, for example, because they didn't give us a lot of money, but that gave us a lot of network and access and technical support and mentoring. They were fantastic. But that's the real challenge. And so right now we're working on a paper with my colleagues, which is under revision in a journal, is that this social enterprise, the hybrid structures like B Corp and all these things, people think that that's going to solve the problem. But actually, when you think about the need for access to capital for developing technology, so resources and legitimacy and autonomy are the ones that actually help force founders to go for a particular structure. I started my company as what is called L3C, which is a low profit limited liability company, deliberately to signal to people that we want to not focus on profit, we want to focus on problem solving. But in February, I incorporated a C Corp in Delaware, because that's the only way I can get the money needed to scale, to grow and impact. And so in a sense, like, it's like my personal story of how, if you have to adopt technology, one, you do need interdisciplinary expertise and people that can work across boundaries. And two is that we need to think about using technology and developing technology, and what is the cost, and who can control those costs, who can fund those costs. And they're going to have some influence on the ultimate outcomes and deliverables. And so, so it's a tricky one. So, so I'm just saying this from a perspective of, I don't have a solution. I am kind of like, iterating as we go along and learning how to make this viable without losing our primary goals, which is to serve underserved populations and create something that does not exist today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much all for sharing such fantastic, interesting, and insightful research and practice. And I must say that I'm deeply impressed by how punctual our panelists are with their time. You guys must have timed your presentation before joining, and for that I also thank you all. I don't believe we have any questions submitted by the audience, and I would assume that it's all because our audience and our panelists want to jump into the questions that we put together. We have put together about 6 questions. But in fact, these can be grouped into 3 different buckets. One is about, our view on transdisciplinary approach to our work. And the second thing is, cautions and risks associated with using technology to address, social justice, inclusion and equity. And then, third one is how it means and how this can be translated into the classroom. So I'm going to invite all the panelists to discuss these 3 big issues. And then I'd like to again invite the audience to submit the questions along the way. Before we break, any of the sort of conversations here, I think it would be good that if we could share, our own view shaped by your research or shaped by the institution on what we mean by transdisciplinary approach and how is it different or similar to other terms that we frequently use, sometimes interchangeably, which include interdisciplinary, and sometimes multidisciplinary. You guys can jump in. I'm not going to give you any order of the whatever. If you want to start by again speaking about your own case, please do.
I guess I would jump in and just say that one thing I was unable to do was credit all of the people involved in the many projects I showed. And game design obviously is something challenging. It's a friend once called it something like designing bridges and operas at the same time. It's got an art and an engineering context. So clearly working with different kinds of practitioners, sound artists and others, coders, illustrators is part of the process. But that's just within the realm of making games. I would say that any game about anything, like the budget sport that I showed, was designed in collaboration with experts, economists, and others. And as a designer, you have to become a mini expert if you're going to design something within a field or about an idea. And so I would just say that to me, the exciting thing about being an educator in game design is that I get to introduce my students to a lot of different things about the world, let them explore their natural curiosity, and also talk to people in different fields in order to better design representations of those things.
Oh, Roberta, do you want to get started?
Yes, I just want to add a comment about what we mean by interdisciplinarity, because sometimes people think, like, for example, the difference between interdisciplinary and multidisciplinarity. Multidisciplinarity to me is just people from different disciplines and backgrounds that work together, but is their working together part of the same whole? I think that's the difference. Whereas interdisciplinarity is when you have different people from different backgrounds, different disciplines, and whatever goal they are trying to achieve cannot be achieved without the other. So for example, digital health definitely has a strong component of computer science and maybe behavioral psychology or healthcare medical science. So I think that's the core difference.
Thanks. I was just reflecting on the question also, not just in terms of our work, but also our worldview. And I find, because I come in from a different discipline, I often look at things in just a subtly different way that to me seems very obvious, but other people then take a very different view of a problem. And I think sometimes that's really where you get the sort of new insight into problems. I think particularly in the research that we have done, we were sort of rubbing up against some of the entrepreneurship literature that so much looks at the individual. And, again, we're looking at the white male individual in particular, but even where this is less of an issue, it is very much the individual. And I think in the context where we were trying to redefine what it means to be entrepreneurial, it's really communities and groups of individuals. There's never one individual making the innovation. It's really much more sort of trial and error of exploring gaps and opportunities, and maybe a little bit more what we'd see in games, where it's actually about much more of a group exploration. And I think that seems to have given license in this context really also to a degree of exploitation, because you cannot protect it, you cannot defend it in quite the same way. It's not a business model that anybody has thrown a brand or a company around. And I think that comes very much from this perception of it is an individual owns an innovation and it needs to be protected. And the context we're looking at, we actually see a lot of innovation, but it cannot be protected. And I also was reflecting what Latha was saying about her experience of developing technology in other contexts, how expensive it can be. I think one of the things that I found very interesting, many years ago, I talked to a technology entrepreneur in Ghana who's been labeled by some people as the Bill Gates of Ghana. It's ironic because his company has been purchased by Microsoft since then, Herman Chinnery Hesse. And he actually developed a technology that very much came from the context, something he called tropically tolerant software, working with old computers. Electricity cuts out, everything needs to be written to disk. Things that nobody in more developed countries would have developed, but that was immensely suitable to those contexts and their restrictions. And he managed to develop this in a cheap and frugal way, really. And that really highlighted to me how development and innovation in different contexts almost naturally looks different because it reflects a different context, a different evolution. And unfortunately, we don't see very much of it over time because very often these spaces to develop this aren't there.
No, I mean, I think I just want to clarify that, what we spent was a pittance compared to our global competitors. But it is just that because, we need more to grow. So I completely understand. And in terms of supply side economics in other places is completely different order of, magnitude in terms of costing. So compared to other, the global north. And so what we spend, people get shocked when they hear how little we spend, but that little itself is a lot if you're a social enterprise and trying to do that. And then I definitely want to say that, for example, not just the Caucasian based, and to go into technical, like, we use 3D MRI images, and we're the only one that can do the lowest resolution, which is like 1.5 Tesla, because that's very common in India. And so we developed it for a less than robust condition. And so definitely nobody else can do it, literally, because they didn't have data from that. That's not their ecosystem where they've developed it. So absolutely, it makes a huge difference in terms of where it is developed and where it's coming from. And in terms of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, I don't think I really understand the difference, to be honest. I think, there are like a lot of common, I think transdisciplinarity seems to be kind of more overall frameworks, whereas interdisciplinarity is like integrating different solutions. And I worked with a lot of engineers and scientists in my previous institution. I worked in technology school, and that's, I think, where I honed my skills to work with people. Like I worked with civil engineers, mechanical engineers, chemists, and different kinds of scientists, because it was a technology school. And so that's who you collaborate with, and from people that study biology and forest biology. And so what I'm saying is that I think one of the things the difficulties or challenges from both, I see that as a person that employs talent from different disciplines, but also has worked on this space, is that it's almost always approached kind of like a teamwork models. That's like you divide things up and share, and then somehow we will stitch together and create a solution that is interdisciplinary. And I think that is the real challenge, because it doesn't work like that, especially in the classroom. I know that people do that. They're like, okay, you're very good at statistics. You do the statistics part. And I'm really good at, editing and language. And so I will do the final edit. And in terms of dividing the final product. And so I think that's a very interesting thing for me to look at. Okay, how do we move from that model in a classroom to a true interdisciplinary or a transdisciplinary engagement where we create something new, drawing on the two sources of expertise. And I see that with my talent too, that when we hire people, we do hire because you need, like, if I need an artificial intelligence programmer, they have to be really good at that. But they also have to be able to speak to a neuroscientist or a clinician who's actually using this. And so more and more, I'm thinking that you really do need that fluency to have these conversations across the silos. And I don't, less and less in terms of deeper education puts you in more of a silo than in less. So I think it's an interesting question to think about how we, educate to work across the silos while giving some expertise in deep expertise in one.
Thank you. Can I jump in? Is my internet connection okay? Yes, cool. No, just two observations. The first is, in gambling research, interdisciplinarity has actually managed to change the public discourse. So much of gambling research was done almost solely by psychologists. And so gambling was seen as problem gamblers. So the whole public discourse was there are people who have gambling problems. They are problem gamblers. And we're now trying to widen that out so that it's looking at people's experience that are much broader than their own problem. It's looking at how, you could be someone supporting a gambler. That makes the discourse completely different. It's now being seen as a public health issue. And a public health issue is very different from an individual having a gambling problem. And I was amazed. We're putting in a bid at the moment for a gambling research centre. And as I said, 6 faculties are all putting in a completely different view of how you can understand gambling harms. It's incredibly exciting to do that. So that's, I think transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity can be very powerful in changing discourses. And the other thing I wanted to say, I was listening to Colleen talking about including experts. In my field of research, the experts are children. And we very, very rarely include children in things that matter to them. So, for example, in advertising regulations, there's a whole load of regulations about things that are of particular appeal to children that you're not allowed to use in advertising messages. But no one's ever asked the children if these things particularly appeal to them. And the research that we've just done shows that actually the things that the adults sitting in the Advertising Standards Authority think appeal to children don't at all. They're completely different things. So I mean, there's transdisciplinarity, but stakeholder engagement too is incredibly important, whether you're talking about non-Caucasians in your database or in my instance, children, where you're talking about them. To me, it becomes incredibly important.
Thank you so very much. I have a question coming from the audience, which is answered. However, again, allocate a couple of minutes to visit this question. So the particular focus of this question is to understand the differences between transdisciplinarity and broader systems approach. And if one of you could actually add on to what Roberta already provided, that'll be really good. Oh, so actually here we have 3 panelists already answer these questions. Is there any other aspects that you'd like to add on to? Okay.
I think that, I think about systems a lot because games are these little simplified and satisfying systems. They disambiguate things in a world that is incredibly ambiguous and difficult to grasp and oftentimes unpredictable. And so what I would say is that to start, systems are models. They're sometimes modeled through games. They're sometimes modeled through our approach to problem solving in the world. As Donella Meadows, who is one of my favorite writers on the subject of systems, says that everything we know is a model. So I just want to highlight that and say that ways of knowing can come from different places. As Agnes said, they can come from children, they can come from adults, they could come from different fields. And I would have to say that for me right now, I'm just an avid reader. And Anna Lowenhaupt-Singh's book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, is a wonderful book. And one thing that she says in that book, which is an anthropological study of a particular type of mushroom and its market, its global market, is that we need new ways of close looking and understanding and knowing from the world on out, right? And so all I would say is those kind of methodologies, whether they're ethnographic or around the social sciences or engineering technology, are important to kind of get underneath and understand how they form systems of knowledge. So it's a kind of a high level answer to a question, I guess, but I would just say that we can never know everything, and everything we do know is a model. So let's try to know things in as many ways as possible.
Thank you, Colleen. That's great. Let's visit the second actually topic. Question topic. One common thread, weaving everybody's research on the panel, on this panel, is technology and social justice. And evidently, we try to understand how technology can actually be used and designed to, in a way, free the legacy practices and stop the recycling privilege, by increasing the access for all to better our lives. And in that sort of approaches and in that sort of practices, how and what kind of risks and concerns that you see again in addressing this social justice and inequality through technology? What sort of a sort of a pitfall or areas to be cautioned about in this sort of efforts?
I think somebody I think it was Roberta who mentioned the wearables, right? And so one of the areas that we're looking at really very seriously in my company is how to use our tool in clinical trials. And clinical trials are going through a very interesting movement towards diversity and inclusion in participation. And one of the things that they're trying is in actually what they call decentralized trials. Which means, because a lot of times I had to learn this, that I didn't realize that I always thought of clinical trial participants as guinea pigs, because that's the kind of like history that we've always read, that they've been tried on with something and people with no power and get, which is true too, which has a history. However, clinical trial access gives alternatives that can be life-saving for people that have no other cure. And that access is mediated by networks that you need to know, knowledge, and literally physical access. If you're like in some rural place so far away and you cannot get, you don't even have to travel overseas, even in the same country, if you cannot travel to get access to, say you have to go to Mayo or Harvard to participate in clinical trial, and somebody who's sitting in Mississippi or like in rural Midwest just don't have the resources to go. So clinical trials is moving towards use of technology. They're collecting data using like other modes of like wearables, and that is like decentralized trials. And I do worry about then, especially outside of Europe, which has a very strong data privacy and security concerns protected, how this is, you are getting access, and it's like, how do you kind of like draw the boundary, especially if they are vulnerable populations that are also, a lot of them are older, a lot of them are sicker, they necessarily don't have the resources or sometimes even cognitive resources to make some decisions, but then they're giving access to their data by participating in this trial. So it's a tricky one, like an example of like technology in the healthcare field and what it can do and what could be the dangers.
If I can add to that, I think technology becomes a sort of, can exacerbate gaps and undermine trust when it's not inclusive from the start. So from the process of design. So, and I think that links what Latha was saying earlier about, what they're trying to do with their company, trying to actually use data who are not just representative of a certain section of the population, but they are actually look at the broader spectrum of who can benefit from that technology. So we've all seen debates about how artificial intelligence, for example, is biased and can actually is not representative or is of little use for people who come from a certain ethnic background or socioeconomic background. And that's all about who designs those technologies and how inclusive, what type of participatory modes, methods of design the developers of these technologies use.
I just add to the, because I haven't obviously sort of jumping in, I mean, as a non-panelist, but an observation that I think that, you know, which addresses, I think, one of the questions around what are the differences between a whole systems approach and what we're talking about here, which is transdisciplinarity. But just some of the commonalities, you know, in all the presentations that we've seen, is that there are some assumptions, you know, that we are challenging. One is knowledge doesn't get produced necessarily with those that have, you know, particular qualifications and work in universities. Clearly, knowledge production is a distributed activity. Hence, children are important when you're designing games. So I think that the idea that knowledge production doesn't just happen in one place is pretty obvious. And I think the next big observation for me is that what we're really doing with transdisciplinarity is inclusive inquiry. We're trying to incorporate as many different voices as we can into the work that we're doing. We all know that technology is nothing other than a tool, and it's those that will use the tools. It is those people, and you know, ultimately the impact that we make in terms of social justice will depend on how we use the tool. And you can use it for good, as we know with technologies, and equally you can use the same technology for different kinds of purposes. And so essentially the context of application is really important. If you're not working with those voices that are going to be applying and using the technology, then obviously your inquiry is going to be limited. It's not going to be so inclusive. And I think the role of inclusive inquiry and being pluralistic with our knowledge production is really important, which makes me wonder whether in the future, how will we construe, you know, actors that are non-human and how will we incorporate those non-human voices into our knowledge production activity? We've already talked about robots and algorithms, and only today in the UK we've been talking about how computers have made some mistakes in pension payments. Was that down to computer programs? Was that down to algorithms? You know, in the future, if robots can think or algorithms can think, or we assign, it's interesting. But just some observations of commonality between the presentations, I think, that were really important, really interesting.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I think what you shared, you know, in the last 20 minutes actually answered our final questions as well, how all this translate into the classroom. And as cliché as it may sound, you know, what we share today, you know, goes to underscore the importance of bringing, you know, multi and holistic perspectives in terms of framing and trying to find the solutions to the problem. And thank you all again. I mean, for this wonderful, you know, opportunity to learn about your research, have an opportunity, you know, to visit these issues all together. You know, it's been just wonderful. And with that, I'd like to, you know, turn this table over to Latha so that she can, you know, close the session. Thank you so much, all, and I look forward to, you know, further conversations on this issue going forward.
Thank you to all the panelists. Great event.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, everybody. This was such a great discussion, and I was also excited to be part of the panel and having this conversation. So I want to, you know, thank all the panelists for spending time and discussing and sharing their research. And thank you, Erin, for your time and leadership and moderating this panel. And thank you, Billy, for persisting through the pandemic to continue this collaboration between the New School and Bristol. And I know that we will continue to, you know, do more. I'm excited about, you know, all the work that we can do between students, faculty, and institutions together. And the next event is going to be, Christina has this, it's October 7th. Which is actually going to be really interesting. And so we will be emailing the details, October 7th, noon to 1:30. which is like the first Thursdays. We have first Thursday events and third Wednesdays. And this is looking at actually role of management and organizations in addressing health equity. So we have a panel drawn from different parts of the healthcare sector, like from insurance to pharma company to patient advocacy organizations and hospital and Planned Parenthood. So this is going to be a very interesting and exciting event. So please join us, and we will be sharing more details. So thank you again, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.